The Washington communique was trying to sort of Trump-proof the future of NATO by embedding all of it in there.
You're listening to the USSC Briefing Room, a podcast from the United States Study Centre at the University of Sydney, where we give you a seat at the table for a USSC briefing on the latest developments in US news and foreign policy. We'll cover what you need to know and what's beneath the surface of the news.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Briefing Room. My name is Jared Monchin. I'm the Director of Research at the United States Study Center. And before we get started, I want to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. Soon, there is going to be a NATO Summit in Europe. And this is going to be a significant one, given what is going on, especially between Ukraine and Russia. But before we talk about that, we should also highlight the fact that there very well may be a number of important bilateral meetings at this NATO summit. And there's a lot of question about Australia's influence, agency, and impact on the summit. And to talk about these issues, I've brought along two fantastic experts on not only Australian foreign policy, but also Australia's role in Europe, particularly with NATO. Firstly, I have Dr. Gorana Grgic, who is a senior lecturer in U.S. politics and foreign policy at the United States Study Center, based at the University of Sydney. But she is currently in residence as a senior researcher with the Swiss and Euro-Atlantic Security Team at the ETH Zurich's Center for Security Studies. I also have non-resident senior fellow at the United States Study Center, Jane Hardy, who is a former Australian senior diplomat and Australian government official who over 4 decades served in 7 Australian embassies in the Indo-Pacific region, the United States, and Europe. And I wanted to bring these two fantastic experts on the podcast to talk about what this summit means, both for Europe, but also Australia. Now, before we get started, I just want to confirm with you, Gorana and Jane, that you have a stat or a figure that you think is relevant to today's discussion that you wouldn't mind sharing at the very end of the episode.
Yes.
I'll pull up something.
Great. Let's dive right in, if that's all right with you two. So there are a lot of questions about Ukraine and the future of Ukraine, but being one of the top experts on Europe and what's going on in the war between Ukraine and Russia, I'd love to hear, Gorana, a quick overview on where we currently stand in this war. Is Russia winning this war right now? Are Ukraine supporters, diverse supporters around the world, are they giving more or less support than they were maybe a year ago?
Yeah, those are a couple of questions there, and I'll try to be very brief. So the conflict remains largely a war of attrition. Frontline shifts are rather limited, even though Russia has made some incremental territorial gains as of the past couple of months since the beginning of the year. And also what we see at the moment is really a ramped up sort of attack, especially in terms of drone warfare. Some attacks and strikes that have been really unprecedented over the past maybe year or so, even as we talk increasingly about getting to the negotiation table. Importantly, I would say there are two things to stress that have happened actually this very month, and that is that as of June 2025, Ukrainian and Western intelligence estimates indicated that Russia's military casualties, so both those wounded and killed on the battleground, have surpassed 1 million, which is quite an alarming milestone, given what Russia has or really hasn't achieved, given its strategic goals at the very outset of this full-scale invasion back in February of 25. And at the same time, another thing that happened at the very beginning of this month, not just that Ukraine continues to defend its territory quite tenaciously, but it has successfully launched Operation Spiderweb, which was a deep strike drone assault on multiple Russian air bases, actually some quite far deep into the Russian territory, that damaged or destroyed several strategic bomber aircrafts and basically demonstrated how Kyiv is growing its capability when it comes to drone warfare, when it comes to expertise in this sort of asymmetric type of conflict. So to very briefly sum up then whether Russia is winning, which was your question, Jared, I would say even though it has some advances on the ground, the overall trajectory is not one which would suggest that Russia is winning in any decisive sense. And that's primarily because Ukraine is defending still, is holding its ground, is protecting the sort of front lines. So it has the ability to absorb the shocks and reorganize still its defense and basically deal with the fact, which now answers your final part of the question, which is the kind of the depleting support from the United States and basically trying to make do with what it has. So in terms of supporters, support for Ukraine, in terms of Ukraine's supporters, allies, what they have been doing, we have basically seen the United States has not been replenishing the aid that we've seen over the previous 3 years. So under the Trump administration, now we have seen that Europe has, for the first time since 2022, surpassed the United States in total military aid. And this is basically led by countries in the north of NATO, so the Nordic countries, and also the United Kingdom, where, for instance, Germany is leaving a lot there wanting in terms of its support. And there are a lot of eyes on Berlin and Chancellor Merz to reverse some of these trends.
So on the whole, not going great for Russia with over 1 million casualties, and Europe is stepping up, which is something that Americans of both Democratic and Republican persuasions have wanted for some time. So on the whole, not great news for Russia. Jane, could you briefly take us through the Australian government's approach to this? When the invasion first occurred in 2022, there was some polling from Lowy that showed a rapid increase in support for supporting Ukraine. But obviously, this is now years into a war, and I guess the novelty of it has worn off. How has the Australian government their approach evolved on this?
Well, that's a great question. When I was in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade Europe area at the time that Russia invaded, there was a lot of discussion in the government, the quick ramp up of some rather symbolic contributions, but substantial contributions, including military aid to Ukraine. Since then, a couple of things I've noticed. One is the language that our government's used about this hasn't changed one iota. It's always been completely unequivocal about Russia's quote unquote illegal and immoral war of aggression. So the language has been very much on values and moral and material support for Ukraine. And I must say, my good friend, the Ukrainian ambassador here in Canberra, has just been very grateful for that and thanked us many times, every single time he sees us, for all the support. But basically, that support now comprises $1.5 billion Australian, which is 1.3 billion in military support. Equipment, the Bushmaster story has taken on a great resonance. We love it, and the Ukrainians are great at telling it because it's a dynamic little story, and also the training of Ukrainian forces. We've also given some other forms of economic support to the Ukrainian government. But I'd say that really throughout the years, the Australian government's approach has become far more horizontal and comprehensive, not just the dollars that we spend, but targeted financial sanctions and travel bans, including on those spreading disinformation. We've supported the EU sanctions against Russian disinformation campaigns. Excuse me. And we've made the very strong link between the consequences for European and Indo-Pacific security of Russia, the Russian actions. This came about, of course, because just prior to Russia's invasion in 2022, then Russia and China had a summit and issued their famous friendship without limits statement. So that link between our two regions has been very prominent in the Australian government's language and our discussions with Europeans about all this. I'd say there are a couple of other things. Multilateral, we're very active multilateral. We're on the UN Multilateral Sanctions Monitoring Team. This really focuses on the DPRK, North Korea, and it's been focusing on North Korea-Russia military cooperation and trying to make sure that the UN sanctions regime maintains its integrity, it's fully implemented, properly implemented, and so on. And also, you'll remember historically, 2014, the downing of Malaysian Airlines flight MH17, the International Civil Aviation Organization has found Russia responsible in recent days. And so our foreign minister has been very much on the front foot. We lost 32, I think, Australian citizens in that on that flight. So I'd say it's been very, very consistent. And I guess there's always a trajectory. You know, the Department of Defense and our industrial base ramps up to find products and military goods that we can usefully donate to Ukraine. We did a few other things with the French, for example. We provided ammunition as a joint effort early on. So, but I think really now we're playing the game globally on multilateral fronts also to just pull all the resources we can, diplomatic and political as well as material, into putting pressure on Russia and providing good support to Ukraine, targeted support.
Great. Thank you, Jane. Now, beyond just Europe and Ukraine, I'd love to hear from your perspective, Garana, as someone who has done more work on and with NATO in Australia than anyone I know. What exactly is the relevance of NATO and I guess European security more broadly to Australia, and how has that exactly shifted in recent years?
Well, I would say, and I would first say, Jane definitely would have a lot more of the sort of institutional sort of insights into this relationship. So I'll also defer to her to fill in maybe gaps that I might leave off. But we have to understand that the relationship between Australia and NATO is not something that's just a product of the past couple of years or decade even. It goes basically as far back as the sort of end of 90s, early 2000s, especially in terms of support that Australia was giving to the United States in Afghanistan. And of course, this being also an operation where NATO was very much involved front and center. So the kind of evolution of Australia-NATO relations also tracks well with this sort of evolution of NATO going from what was the sort of default settings of the Cold War, which were defense and deterrence, into more crisis management and prevention, and then also cooperative security, which are the other two core tasks along with defense and deterrence. So it's all built on very sort of specific agreements that govern the relationship, and these days it's called the individually tailored partnership program, or ITPP, which basically is this sort of way that NATO has revised its sort of partnerships with basically over 40 partner states that really span the globe. And Australia here actually occupies a very sort of prestigious position, I would say, because even in 2014, as a result of the NATO Summit in Wales, when the program of Enhanced Opportunity Partnership, which was basically meant to enhance interoperability with a select couple of partners, this is where Australia was represented along with 5 other partner states, and then various other initiatives where Australia is now sitting at the table, you know, in the context of the IP4, the Indo-Pacific 4, along with Japan Japan, South Korea, and New Zealand, in discussions that some other partner states are really not sort of part of or not privy to. So in a nutshell, it does have quite a deep, I would say, and also broad kind of menu of things that it deals with. But when it comes to really the moment that we are in now, and it is undoubtedly defined by Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine and the ongoing war, we can see that the way that Australia, and I think, again, Jane has provided a really great overview of the sort of government rhetoric and sort of various initiatives that Australia takes part in. But I would just underscore how much Australia's security calculus has changed and has become increasingly globalized as a result of what Russia has been doing on the European soil. So this sort of precedent of unprovoked aggression against a sovereign democracy has underscored the risk that is posed by revisionist powers all over the world, right? And notably in the Indo-Pacific. And that's that sort of language of the strategic concept of 22 that NATO launched at the Madrid Summit, which said what happens in the Indo-Pacific matters for Europe and vice versa, right? And I think that Australia really takes a lot of lessons now about deterrence, about resilience, about coalition building in basically seeing how NATO has responded to Russia, how Ukraine is responding to Russia, and how Australia can then develop its own strategies to counter coercion in its own region. So we then see a lot more appetite these days as well for Australia to join in some of these either lessons sharing, right, and learning from one another, or really, defense industry collaboration. And there's a lot there these days that's being talked about, in terms of what partners from the Indo-Pacific can do with NATO member states, or what they're already doing in that context to really not just learn, but to implement some of these lessons. And again, to build coalitions, especially as both the allies in the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific are trying to sort of adapt as they go to the Trump administration that is in a lot of ways quite unpredictable and uncertain over particular commitments. So we see a lot more of that these days.
Great. Thanks for that, Corona. Now, ahead of the NATO summit, Jane, I'd love to ask you, what are Australia's top priorities at this summit? And what does success for Australia at the summit look like?
Well, as we speak, I believe there's a report that Prime Minister Albanese will not be going to The Hague next week for the NATO summit, which is disappointing. But in many respects, I understand what happens with government decisions like that. But DPM Miles will go, Deputy Prime Minister. Look, I think our top priority is to understand NATO collective deterrent efforts, sort of understand that core role for NATO that Gorana mentioned earlier, and ways Australia can play in support of that. But also, as we have said, to solidify the links between Australia and NATO, as we both sides now better appreciate the global nature of the threats we're facing. So we're not in NATO, but we're very deeply connected to the issues that are directly confronting NATO. A lot of media attention will be on whether the US who goes and what is said at NATO. And of course, that's natural. As Gorana said, there's a kind of unpredictability about the situation among allies now. But I think there are some positive signs. As an official, we see the work going on underneath the radar. We see all the preparations. We see US officials and military continued involvement in rolling out the new types of plans and priorities for NATO. So that's very positive. And by the way, the Supreme Allied Commander Europe is to be a US citizen, Air Force General. So that's positive too, because at one stage there was some chatter about whether the US would not reappoint the Supreme Commander to NATO, which has been a historic function and very important symbol. But equally, among the top priorities, I'd say not just to hear about NATO's deterrence efforts and the very world-leading kind of collective security that NATO rolls out, but it's equally to influence NATO members on Australia's view, both of Russia, Ukraine, but of other elements that are affecting global stability. Russia DPRK has been a very strange and a little bit disarming. Not just a little bit. I'm quite concerned about that Russia DPRK renewed military alignment, and other things. Of course, China's relationship with Russia and China's involvement in Europe. And a couple of years ago, at the outbreak of the war, Lithuania was famously very, very strongly economically coerced by China over a political incident and that was a very difficult thing to see. At that time, many in Europe actually looked at us because we'd come out of a couple of years of severe economic coercion by China. So there are all these interlinkages, and I think we have to outline to NATO partners, including the US, of course, our commitment to defence spending, why we're spending the way we are. AUKUS is always a part of that discussion. The Secretary General, Mark Rutte, has actually defined a new NATO defence spending goal of 5% of GDP. The new defence investment plan, he calls it. That 5% for each country would include military and non-military security spending. So it's very ambitious. Of course, there are various steps to that. He's just commended Canada at the G7 for announcing an increase in its GDP per capita spending on defence. So all of these things are building up a picture of Europe really stepping up in a way that, I'm sure the Americans and President Trump wanted to see. So it's reassuring, but we've got to tell our story. Look, we've got to tell our story in a way that's more than just raw numbers. The discussion of NATO efforts to ramp up their defence industrial base is another element, and there are implications possibly for AUKUS Pillar 2 about that. So we need to stay at the forefront of that discussion about advanced technology and the role we can play, or we can collaborate with the Europeans.
Garana, Jane covered quite a lot in there, including what NATO members are maybe looking to do. But any other top priorities for NATO, or for that we should also make sure to highlight, or what success would look like for NATO members in this instance?
I mean, it depends how you define success and, where we are at this particular moment in the Atlantic Alliance, because getting now to actually a joint communique out of the summit, given that there's been some rumbling over Spain actually not signing on to what Jane alluded to, is this new defense capability target of 3.5 plus 1.5, and saying that this is just way over ambitious for the state of kind of fiscal health of Spain. We'll see what happens with that. But okay, if we raise the bar somewhat, right, and assume that there is going to be a communique, I think primarily we will be all looking at the kind of burden sharing equation, right, and how the allies have agreed to this, because it's both a political signal and kind of a coup for the U.S. administration. Can go back to Washington and say, look, we made Europeans really step up finally. But I think that it will have also cross-regional implications. And some of that we've already heard at the recent Shangri-La dialogue, when Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, said to the Indo-Pacific allies, look, guys, even Germany is now stepping up, and, Europeans are dealing with a threat that's comparatively lesser than what China is presenting to all of you. So it might also start this sort of discussion, which actually in some cases has already commenced. And I think that Prime Minister Albanese has been asked to comment on that, in my following at least of what the discussion has been in Australia. The other maybe two things that I will be looking at are, of course, Ukraine. So commitments in terms of support, whether it's in terms of just pure military aid, what sort of language is there, or, again, the kind of Ukraine group that meets and that has been actually taken out of the United States kind of coordinating role in a way to Trump proof. That was the language last year already at the Washington Summit and where that goes. But most specifically, what I'll be looking at is the language on Ukraine's potential future in NATO, because last year basically there was the kind of phrase that Ukraine is on an irreversible path to membership. And given everything that President Trump and some of his closest associates have said about Ukraine, in the past couple of months, I'd be really curious to see whether this still holds, right? That Ukraine is indeed on an irreversible path, or is this language going to change? And then I said the other thing that I'll be watching is actually language on China. So I think that there's been also a lot of the discussions in terms of this whole, Europeans should focus on the Euro-Atlantic theater and, maybe not do so much in the Indo-Pacific that we've heard from the likes of Bridge Colby. This was actually directed at the UK just a couple of weeks ago. And really to see how the kind of language of cross-regional cooperation is framed these days, whether there's going to be any change to the kind of way that China is described, maybe even in a more assertive manner and similar, because again, last year the phrase that was used to describe China was as a decisive enabler. And Jane already alluded to these various interlocking relationships that we see across the two theaters, right? Whether it's Russia, China, Russia, DPRK, right? That basically complicates the sort of threat environment and basically necessitates a lot more of cooperation across regions, even if the United States administration currently wants to see the kind of strict focus, or if you want, ruthless prioritizing of theaters, and is willing to have more appetite for potential even riskier kind of situations in the Euro-Atlantic as it focuses on the Indo-Pac.
Last question before we move to the rapid fire round. Jane, diplomats have a lot of work to do. Usually NATO summits have, multiple 2.5-hour sessions and a long summit communique that's dozens of pages long. This year's summit will only have one 2.5-hour session and just a 1-page, 5-paragraph communique. Do you think this year's shortened format change the summit altogether?
No, I don't think so. I think the shortened summit sessions and possibly a much shorter communique will be fine, so long as they say the right things. I think this relates to Gorana's excellent comments there about Europe and the Secretary General of NATO basically adjusting to the Trump effect, if I may say so. The Washington communique was a pretty astonishing length, even by multilateral standards. We're used to these. Often we'll do a short, sharp communique with a big work program underneath. But I think as Gorana was describing it was the Washington communique was trying to sort of Trump-proof the future of NATO by embedding all of it in there. Look, if it's shorter, it's not a problem. It doesn't indicate a problem. It indicates a problem if they can't come to agreement on a communique. But I hope they will obviously come to agreement on a communique that has top-line, unambiguous messages about the core NATO effects of deterrence and defence, but also about those other other areas of NATO engagement, crisis prevention management, which is done with us and others around the world, and ideas about cooperative security that are really important in this day and age, with security representing something a lot broader than traditional defence and deterrence concerns. The communique should emphasise what NATO's being able to achieve. You know, at Vilnius, the Allied Reaction Force was announced. This is a high readiness, multi-nation forces, many of them located in the frontline countries along Russia's border. And they are attempting to develop ways of working together in high readiness to confront all sorts of issues: hybrid warfare, cyber attacks, and coordinated responses across all the operational domains. So this is a very post-21st century high-tech endeavour. And it's devilishly hard to get countries to work together. Look at the peacekeeping operations throughout history. It's such a hard thing to do. But I think NATO is a world leader in this sort of thing. So the communique should really demonstrate this, because deterrence is only effective if it's credible. And so the messaging is the first element of deterrence. It's the diplomatic side of deterrence, if you like. So I hope the communique also references what Garana mentioned, all of those elements, and also the fact that the Indo-Pacific Four are in the room with NATO. This is such an important development for us, and I hope for NATO also.
Great. Now, rapid fire round. All right, Garana, you have 30 seconds with Prime Minister Albanese. What is your advice for the ongoing realities in Europe and the future of the NATO alliance? And then over to you, Jane. 30 seconds. Let's hear it.
30. I would just say signal robust support as Australia has demonstrated for Ukraine at any forum that presents itself, not just as a way to, do good things and show solidarity with European partners, but really because this makes sense to reinforce deterrent messages that are relevant to the Indo-Pacific. And I would strongly suggest that Australia signs the EU Security and Defense Partnership, as there has been a lot of chatter on that, because it will open up a lot of opportunities for defense industrial cooperation.
Jane, let's hear it.
Okay, Prime Minister, defence spending and defence industry are now front and centre for us and all allies. After 50 plus years of a peace dividend and the effects of the Cold War, we now have to really reconfront these core issues. So you need to try and tell NATO that we are important to them. Also, we need to exploit the immense benefits of our partnership with NATO. And Prime Minister, look at the way the Europeans are handling the United States and the United States administration. I think that's probably world's best practice at the moment. There are some great lessons for you, Prime Minister, in the way you might handle your future meeting with President Trump.
Great. Now, let's get to our stat or figure. Garana, I'll start with you. I believe you have a stat on NATO that you think is relevant.
I do, and that is 32 out of 32, so 100% batting average, or however you want to put it, but that's basically...
I think it's 1,000. You're not American, but that's okay. We still love you.
Which is why I should never do any type of sports-related sort of references or analogies. But anyway, suffice to say that Mark Rutte, the SecGen of NATO, just recently said that all NATO countries will hit 2% defense spending target this year. So this was a goal that was set in Wales now nearly 11 years ago. But as we've heard already, the goalposts keep keep on shifting. So a decade after this goal was set, now it's being met. But again, it's going to take 3.5 for sort of classical traditional defense, and then 1.5 for everything that's kind of broadly defense related to keep Europeans, at least from the US perspective, in good books, but not just for the US perspective, but really for European home security. There needs to be sort of a lot more seriousness with which Europeans approach their own defense and deterrence. So that would be my stat.
Excellent. Now, Jane, your stat or figure.
My figure is 1,400. Australia has now imposed a total of more than 1,400 sanctions in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and has targeted financial sanctions on 79 Russian entities. So this is Australia's largest sanctions package since the outbreak of the war. And they build on other packages. So, we imposed autonomous sanctions in relation to Russia in response to Crimea, 2014. These were extended 2015, 2022, 2023. We expanded the number of items of imports and exports, activities, services, and assets, and persons on whom these on whom these sanctions are imposed. So I think we have to keep up that effort and really reinforce it, because the sanctions regime, both through the UN and autonomously by countries around the world seeking to curtail Russia and Russia's relationships with other malign actors, is incredibly important. Hard to see, often disparaged, but I think it's a very important exercise, and we should continue. 1,400 and counting.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jane. As we wrap up, I'd like to point out a couple of other podcasts that may be of interest. Our CEO, Dr. Michael Green, is co-host of the Asia Chessboard podcast. I'd also recommend checking out the USSC live podcast series that runs recordings from our major live events, including our Sydney International Strategy Forum from last year, our election watch series from last year, and a number of others. You can find these on our website, ussc.edu.au, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks so much again, Gurana and Jane.
Thank you, Jared.